Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 59 of This Week in FCPA for the week ending June 30, 2017, the holiday edition. In this day, which starts the July 4th weekend, Jay and I return for a wide-ranging discussion on some of the week's top compliance-related stories. I must note that explicit language is used in this podcast. Some of our stories include the Sessions Justice Department releases its second declination involving CDM Smith. We take a look at that and what it may mean going forward. The trial of the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea continues in France. The trial is for embezzlement of funds from Equatorial Guinea, and we highlight the trial reports that are found in the Global Anti-Corruption blog. We ask the question that is posed in the following book, The Chickenshit Club, by Jesse Eisinger. Is the DOJ afraid to go to trial in white-collar prosecutions? The book, we link to the book for pre-sale and a review in the Financial Times. I ask, which is your favorite blog post of the year so far, or one you think has been the most significant? My nominee is Susan Fowler, the former Uber engineer, whose blog post led to the Holder Report. In an extraordinarily interesting and important podcast, Matt Kelly talks to Hui Chen. The podcast is found on Matt's site, Radical Compliance. We discuss some of the highlights from Hui Chen's discussions with Matt. Jay previews his, actually talks about his weekend report, which he posted yesterday. We note that at the nearly halfway mark of the Major League Baseball season, the Houston Astros lead the majors with the best record. We also report that the Everything Compliance Episode 13 podcast is out. And I talk about a very exciting development that I'm coming out with on July 10th, which is the introduction of the Compliance Podcasting Network. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode of This Week in FCPA with my good friend and colleague, Mr. Monitors, Jay Rosen. Jay, welcome.
Thanks, Tom.
So, Jay,
how is it? How is it in Houston Astros land?
Houston Astros land is number one in the Major League Baseball pennant race this year, best record in baseball. But we're recording this on the Friday before July 4th, so this is our holiday edition. So happy July 4th to everyone. We're going to talk about some of the interesting things that happened this week. We had turns out a flurry of activity today. So, Jay, why don't we just hop right into it? And starting off with the Sessions Justice Department has issued the second declination of 2017 since the Trump administration took over for a company called CDM Smith. They were represented by our good friend Nat Edmonds. So shout out to Nat Edmonds for securing a declination. It was for the company's actions in India, where they paid approximately $1.18 million in bribes to government officials in exchange for highway construction supervision and design contracts and a water project contract, resulting in approximately $4 million in net profits. The bribes were generally 2 to 4% of the contract price, and they were paid through fraudulent subcontractors who provided no actual services and understood that their payments were meant to solely benefit the Indian officials, the corrupt Indian officials. In addition, the division responsible for CDM Smith's work in India paid $25,000 to local officials regarding the water project contract. So there's we're going to link to the declination itself in the show notes. We've also got a link to Dick Cassin's excellent summary article of the declination. There is really a dearth of information about the specific actions which the company and their counsel led to garner this declination, but those are set out in the declination itself. And CDM Smith agreed to pay $1.037 million in disgorgement and $4.037 million in disgorgement, which represented their profits, and they got a slight little payout. The first payment due 10 days after the signing, and then September 1 and October 1. So a little little wiggle room there. But Jay, here we now have two FCPA enforcement actions or non-enforcement actions, maybe more properly in the form of declinations from the Trump administration. It seems to me that the government is sending a very clear signal. Are you seeing something different over there on the left coast?
No, I completely agree. And, and a little bit later on, we're going to give a plug for our Everything Compliance podcast, which posted yesterday. And I don't want to take full credit, but I did take a look at FCPA sabermetrics, and I noticed that things were a little bit lacking in Q1 and Q2 of this year. But then I did say that we're only halfway through. So this does give me a little bit more confidence. And the other thing I noted here, and I think this language is probably a result of the recent Supreme Court decision upon whether or not disgorgements are tax deductible, but in the second to last paragraph, it says, CDM Smith acknowledges that no tax deduction may be sought in connection with any part of its payment of the disgorgement amount. That's what I have to say. I think this is good news, and let's see what happens after the long holiday weekend.
So a couple of other things, I really hadn't put two and two together, but we released the podcast, and the very next day, there's a resolution announced. Man, I just didn't realize the power of Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitors, and the podcast. So we need to consider that for our advertising rate going forward. But a couple of other things really struck me, Jay. The first one was, you correctly pointed out that there would be no part of the monies paid would be tax deductible, or the company would take no tax deduction. The next sentence says, and I quote, CDM Smith further agrees that it will not seek or accept directly or indirectly reimbursement or indemnification from any source with regard to the disgorgement amount. And Jay, I found that, I don't want to say troubling, but at least interesting for a couple of reasons. If you think back to the Linde gas decision, in Linde, the company had reserved or put in escrow payments to a group of individuals it had bought a company from who became employees of Linde Gas, and part of their payout was in this escrowed money. That escrowed money, or the money was escrowed when the company discovered the illicit payments. And the clear implication was part of that escrowed money was held back because of FCPA violations. And part of that money may have been used to resolve the Linde gas declination with disgorgement. So here we have the government stating and CDM Smith agreeing that they will not seek reimbursement or indemnification. So does that would seem to preclude that them going for a clawback or any other type of actions against employees or third parties who may have profited from this illegal scheme. And so that's not something we have seen before that last sentence. We had seen that companies had agreed not to take a tax deduction. So I wonder, we may have to keep an eye on that moving forward, because, Jay, if a company makes a disgorgement either for declination or for just a regular FCPA enforcement action, it's possible that they could seek a clawback from any executives who were involved or others. So just something to maybe watch going forward.
Is it possible that the DOJ is leaving space for their own individual prosecution?
Well, that was my original thought, but this really does not seem to touch upon that. And the government, Smith could not agree with the government to have the government not prosecute individuals. Only individuals can agree with the government to that. So even if Smith agreed that it would not, or the government agreed with Smith, they would not prosecute any individuals, that really, you can only have that agreement with individuals. I guess the larger point I'd like to raise, Jay, is that clearly self-disclosure is an appropriate mechanism. And the result that CDM Smith received, taken together with Linde Gas, really is a superior result, and that certainly companies can try to tee it up and go to trial against the government, but there's really no upside to that, because you have to admit basically you engaged in bribery and corruption, and here clearly the company did, just as they clearly did in Lindy Gas. So not taking advantage of this pilot program, even expanded beyond what it originally was. I think any lawyer who would recommend that a company do that really is shirking their obligations to a company.
Definitely agree. And I guess going forward, it would be interesting to learn what was the timetable on this declination, and whether or not, as we get more and more of these, we should see how effective the pilot program has been, because DOJ's intent was to try to get through these things in less than a year. So maybe Nat will be able to shed a little light on this when we see him this fall at the SCCE annual CEI in Las Vegas.
That's a great point. Jay, I'd like to note that the excellent trial reports from the trial of the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea, who's in trial in France for embezzlement of funds, is still ongoing. And we've got 2 more reports up on the Global Anti-Corruption blog. I wanted to pose the following question to you, Jay. What is your favorite blog post of the year, or what do you find to be the most significant one of the year? And I will start it off by telling you that mine was former Uber engineer Susan Fowler, who in my mind has the top blog post, because I think it directly led to the investigation of the company by the Holder Report. And the first paragraph of the Holder Report, in fact, says, on February 19, 2017, Susan Fowler, a former engineer at Uber, published a blog post detailing allegations of harassment, discrimination, and retaliation during her employment at Uber. The next day, Uber retained Eric Holder and Tammy Alvaran to conduct an investigation, to conduct a review. So pretty clear direct link there. And for those of us out there blogging, this is a pretty powerful post. And it's going to be interesting to see the continued fallout from Uber. But what I'd like to just give a shout out to is Susan Fowler for pointing all this out. I think this is just an incredibly powerful blog post. I've read the entire blog post. It's based upon her personal experience and her talking to others. It's written obviously from the heart. She obviously cared about the company, was not very pleased with the way she was treated, as you will see what happened to her by reading the blog post. But it really shows to me, Jay, the power of a social media tool that maybe people had not considered that powerful previously.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that, Tom. Is there any color as to, she just posted it, it was her personal blog, and did anyone else pick it up, or do you have any idea on how it spread so quickly?
It just seemed to spread like fire through social media, Jay, and it just went viral. And national newspapers picked it up. Obviously, the Uber board picked it up, because the next day they hired Covington and Burling to do a thorough review. So I think it just kind of went out on its own. But you're right, it was posted on her personal blog site. So very, very powerful blog post, and it'll be interesting to see if our readers have any other nominees, or listeners, I should say, have any other nominees, and where the second half of the year takes blogging.
Yeah, so I would definitely agree with you that hers is the most powerful blog post, and maybe we should nominate the Uber Holder Report for the most informative, report out. I don't know if we would call it a report, but an investigative report, because it really, is an eye opener as to how toxic that corporate culture was there. So I think if you take these 2 documents together, it really paints a picture of not only life at Uber, but life potentially in Silicon Valley. I think that there was some headline that I read yesterday about, Google and that it's still, a white male dominated type company. So, the call for diversity of opinion and diversity of skills is still being heard loud and clear.
Said like the father of two twin girls, and I will add as the father of a somewhat older girl, certainly here. Next, we have to give a huge shout out and huge tip of the hat to our colleague, Matt Kelly, because today he posted a podcast with Hui Chen. He wrote about it. It's all up on Radical Compliance. It's linked to in the show notes, but it's a very interesting discussion with Hui Chen that focuses on the evaluation of corporate compliance programs document, which was released in February. And I urge everyone to listen to the podcast because it will give you some great insight into what led to the creation of that document, how Hui Chen thinks compliance officers should consider that document going forward, and how they can frankly use it. And there are just a couple of thoughts that I really would like to put forward, which came from the podcast. And the first one was recognizing that when Hui Chen would look at a compliance program, it was a company that was in the throes of an FCPA investigation. And she said really what compliance officers need to take away from the evaluation of corporate compliance documents is to get beyond the buzzwords. Tone at the top is clearly a buzzword, but she wants to know, what has your senior management executive level done for your compliance program? And more importantly, have you documented that? They've sent emails. Great. Show me the emails. Show me who the emails were sent to. Show me the number of times they sent out emails. They did a 5-minute video that's attached to the code of conduct. How many people saw that? Well, it's attached to their code of conduct training. How many people can you tell me affirmatively viewed that rather than ticked off the box that they've received code of conduct training? Just a really interesting point that even compliance officers need to do this. And certainly the lawyers that are involved in many of these cases, she said really need to get to, of course, operationalization of compliance. And she posed the following question that I think every compliance officer should ask, which is, what does your compliance program mean for your employees? How are they trained? Is the training effective? Is the training tailored for them? How can they make the decisions around the compliance issues which they touch on in their individual business workings for the company? What does compliance mean for the individual employee? And that's what is, I think, a fabulous definition of operationalizing, is moving it down to what does it mean to the individual level. But it's a much more wide-ranging interview, and certainly every compliance officer needs to take a listen and consider what she said in terms of some of the points that may have been misinterpreted by some in the compliance community. She is pretty straightforward about some of the misinterpretations that she believes occurred. So shout out to Matt. Having Hui Chen's voice contribute to the compliance community and the discussion of the compliance profession, I think, will only add to the richness and fervor of the compliance profession. So I look forward to seeing what what other information she can share with us going forward, Jay.
Yeah, it's about time that she actually gets to speak on her own. She, as we have noted, has been tweeting and posting up a storm on LinkedIn, but she has some great insights into what's happening in the community. She has a wealth of experience, and it'll be interesting to see who's going to be lucky enough to get her counsel going forward and being able to share that with the rest of the community.
So, Jay, we had an interesting announcement of a book release. Now, the book has not been released for publication. It will be released on July 11th. And it has a title which we're going to read here. Of course, this is a PG podcast. I pride myself on all my material is PG. But we're going to have to violate that because it will have explicit language, but I'm quoting a work of art, or at least a title of a book. So I suppose I can take the liberty to do it. But it's a book by Jesse Eisinger, called the Chickenshit Club. Why the Justice Department fails to prosecute executives. And in its write-up on Amazon, it says from Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Jesse Eisinger, a blistering account of corporate greed and impunity and the reckless, often anemic response from the Department of Justice. Why were no bankers put in prison after the financial crisis of 2008? Why do CEOs seem to commit wrongdoing with impunity? The problem goes beyond banks deemed too big to fail to almost every large corporation in America, to pharmaceuticals, autos, and beyond. The Chickenshit Club, an inside reference to prosecutors too scared of failure and too daunted by legal impediments to do their job, explains why. So once again, it will be released on July 11th. Certainly in our world, I think it will be a very interesting read. Jay, we've linked to a review that is in the Financial Times. And given the recent comments by New York sitting federal district judge about the lack of individual prosecutions in the Ziv case, I think this is going to put more pressure on the Department of Justice. Yet, with the certainly with the Yates memo, the structural form or the structure for the DOJ to move forward against individuals is there. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of that dynamic if that question is answered or at least considered in Eisinger's book, or if it's really just a review. Nevertheless, I think within the white-collar defense community, there's already a buzz about this book, and it's going to be interesting to get it and read it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you can get it. You can sign up to get it early, I believe, on Amazon UK, but it's not listed here yet on Amazon US. So I think their publishing date was August 7th or 8th. So we'll have to see if it either shows up earlier stateside or how we can get a copy of it.
So, well, on Amazon, it says it's released July 11th. So
July 11th. Okay, so it's only a week and a half out.
Yep. So, I think you finally got the Jay Rosen Weekend Report up. Why don't you tell us about?
Yeah. It only took 2 long weekends, but continuing with my series about how to use compliance as a competitive advantage. First blog post looked at that. The second blog post looked at how we can all come together and build our metaphorical barn. And now we're going to take a look at breaking down the silos. And I've entitled this week's post, Using GE's Workout Process to Break Down Compliance Silos and Build a Competitive Advantage. So hope you enjoy it, and sorry it took so long.
So we'll link to that in the show notes, and really looking forward to that, Jay. Jay, as you know, yesterday,
Hey, Tom, again, you've dropped out for a sec. So I spoke about my book, not my book, sorry. I spoke about my post this week, and anything new happening with your book, or any plans coming up in the month of July that you'll be speaking anywhere?
I guess I can have a little teaser announcement, Jay, because in the second week of July, I'm going to be announcing the founding of the Compliance Podcasting Network. And it's going to consist of 8 podcasts that I'm involved with. And it will be a fabulous resource for the compliance practitioner or the compliance professional going forward. It'll certainly be the only compliance podcasting network. Of course, This Week in FCPA will be one of the featured podcasts coming out every Friday throughout the year. So that's been the other project I've been working on. And I'm really looking forward to getting that up and getting that going. The podcast will be, of course, as I said, This Week in FCPA, the daily 1 Month to Better Compliance Program podcast, where I have a different subject each month, the FCPA Compliance Report, the Compliance Report International Edition, where I have compliance practitioners from outside the United States. I'm really excited to announce the founding of another podcast on board governance and risk called Across the Board, We've got Compliance Into the Weeds with our good friend and colleague Matt Kelly, the Everything Compliance, which someone named us the Four Amigos of Compliance. So perhaps we may have to take on that moniker, Jay. My podcast on business leadership, 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership, hosted by Richard Lummis, will move over to the Compliance Podcasting Network. It's currently been sitting on the Rainmaker platform, so I'll add that in. In addition, I've got Unfair and Unbalanced, a podcast that I engage in with Roy Snell and from the SCCE, where we really focus on the compliance profession. So it's, for me, a pretty exciting endeavor. Putting the podcasting, the Compliance Podcast Network has really been a labor of love, and I really wanted to bring together a network of podcasts for the compliance professional and compliance practitioner that they can tune in and utilize in a wide variety of ways. So the breadth and scope of the topics that I'm going to be able to cover, I think will give every compliance professional and practitioner a broad base of information, knowledge, and education going forward.
So on behalf of Tom Fox and myself, Jay Rosen, we'd like to thank you for joining us, taking a look at the week that was in FCPA for the week ending June 30th. We hope you all have a safe and fun 4th of July weekend, and we look forward to speaking with you next week. Thanks so much.
This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and also help get the word out about the only weekly podcast in compliance. Also, if you want to reach Jay, you can reach him at jrosen at Affiliated Monitors, and I am at tfox at tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to This Week, and I hope you will join us again for another episode of This Week in FCPA.